Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of Understanding Our Founders' Constitution. And indeed, it is important that we understand what our Founders' Constitution was all about, because it is under assault from apparently every side, it seems like, nowadays. And it has reached the point where you have to wonder even if we have a Constitution at all, because it is so routinely ignored and violated. Now, last week, I began sharing with you some thoughts that Thomas Paine wrote that were just absolutely brilliant on what a Constitution is, how it comes about, and what its purpose is. And so I want to review just a couple of things that we touched on for your remembrance that we did last week, and then finish out some of the quotes that I want to share with you this evening. You remember that so many people seem to think that the Constitution is like an agreement or a contract, if you will, between we the people and the government. After all, it starts out, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, so on and so forth. But that is not the case whatsoever, because a contract is made between two parties who are in existence, whether it be two people, two groups of people, obviously are living, or person and a corporation or a company or some other entity. They are both in existence, and both therefore enter into a contract that binds the two of them together. But as Paine points out, he says a constitution is not the act of a government, but of a people constituting a government. That is, prior to there being a constitution, there is no government. It is the Constitution that creates the government. And really, in truth, as our preamble states, it is who that creates the government. It is we, the people. We created the government, and we did it via the means of a constitution. So the Constitution is really a contract, or a compact, if you will, between us, the people, as to what type of government do we want to have, between the various states as to what type of government they are willing to form, and what type of government they're willing to cede certain powers to, while retaining others to themselves. Paine also said that a government without a constitution is power without a right. Now consider our situation at this day and time. We have a president who routinely bypasses the Constitution and the limits placed upon him by it. Our legislature creates programs and agencies and departments without end, it seems like, that are nowhere within the enumerated powers of the Constitution. And so they are, in effect, acting outside the Constitution. Now let me ask you this question. If you are acting outside the boundaries of the Constitution, are you really acting under a Constitution? In effect, do you really have a Constitution if that is the type of activity going on? I think the answer is rather obvious, is it not? Whenever you act beyond the limits and the boundaries and the authority of the Constitution, you are acting aconstitutional. Unconstitutional, if you want to think of it that way, or anti-constitutional. And therefore, as that being the case, as Paine said, a government without a constitution is a power without a right, then a government that acts outside the boundaries of the Constitution is acting without a constitution, and therefore it is exerting power that it has no right to exert. And we must call our representatives and our senators and our presidents and everybody else that we have a voice with in our government to account for this. Now, what is the purpose of a constitution? Well, it sets forth the principles upon which man and the society within a country are to be governed. But we hear a lot of times people today saying, well, that's the precedent, that it's been decided that this is how we're going to apply the Constitution. And we hear a lot of talk about judicial precedent, as though that takes priority over the Constitution. Nothing takes priority over the Constitution. And yet, Paine had this to say about this idea of precedent. See if this doesn't make sense to you. He said, government by precedent, without any regard to the principle of the precedent, is one of the vilest systems that can be set up. In numerous instances, the precedent ought to operate as a warning and not as an example, and requires to be shunned instead of imitated. But instead of this, precedents are taken in the lump and put at once for constitution and for law. Is that not what we see happening with us? over the years, court rulings have been decided, and that ruling becomes the precedent for future decisions, the basis for those decisions, rather than the Constitution, or rather than the law. That, he says, is one of the vilest systems that can be set up, because if a precedent sets you on the wrong track, and it becomes the basis upon which future decisions are made, you will continue to go further and further off track from where you were supposed to be headed. And you'll never reach the destination that the Constitution at one point in time pointed you in the direction of. And so precedents are so dangerous and ought to be shunned, and yet we rely on them in our government all the time. He says, though, a nation has a right to substitute, or rather to establish, a constitution. When this right is established in a nation, there is no fear it will be employed to its own injury. A nation can have no interest in being wrong. In other words, when you form a constitution saying, this is what we want, this is what will satisfy us, this is what will be in our best interest, because we don't want to hurt ourselves. So that's why we have this Constitution, to limit government from hurting us. And yet, not all constitutions are constitutions of liberty, are they? The old Soviet Empire, the Soviet Union, a communist operation, they had a constitution, but it wasn't for the best interest of the people. He continues by saying that in forming a constitution, it is first necessary to consider what are the ends for which government is necessary. Secondly, what are the best means and the least expensive for accomplishing those ends? When we look at our Constitution and those who established it, who wrote it, and who ratified it, what was the ends of government that they had in mind? Well, in the ratification debates on June 5th, 1788, Patrick Henry rose in the Virginia Convention and gave this statement: "For liberty ought to be the direct end of your government." That is its purpose. Liberty, the preservation of, for all, equally. In writing in the Federalist Papers, Madison gave a different twist. He said the purpose of government is justice. Bastiat, in his treatise, The Law, wrote that what is the law? Why do we have law? He gave a one-word answer. The law is justice. So justice, liberty. If there is no justice, there can be no liberty. And they do therefore go hand in hand. And that is why we have our Constitution. And if the Constitution is perverted, or government acts outside the bounds of the Constitution so that liberty is constrained or destroyed, or justice is perverted and injustice results, then we have a government that is not meeting the ends to which the Constitution created it to be. And furthermore, look at the way he said. He said that the best means of this should be the least expensive. Do you think we have that today? Look at our $17 trillion debt and growing, not to mention the trillions of unfunded liabilities. Well, he goes on, and he says that when there is a constitution which defines the power and establishes the principles within which a legislature shall act, there is already a more effectual check provided and more powerfully operating than any other check can be. That is, that check is the Constitution. And we talk about this in our government, that we have a system of checks and balances. The executive branch checks the legislative through the means of the veto. And the judicial power, the judiciary, checks both the legislative and the executive. And the executive and the legislature check the judicial by means of appointments and confirmations. And so when these checks are in play as they are designed, then there can be no more an effectual check to preserve the principles of freedom and liberty than that. But here's what I really like what he says. He goes on and says, the check in the Constitution that we have, which in effect says this: thus far shalt thou go, and no further. You see, the Constitution is not something which guarantees us our rights. He later says that cannot be given by a compact. but rather it is a limitation on the power and the extent of that power and the authority that the government has to operate upon us. And so then there cannot be a constitution for liberty which gives the government more power than we, the people, want it to have. He goes on and talks about what can happen when people get lots of money in government and how that would affect the Constitution. He says, give to any man $1,000,000 a year and add thereto the power of creating and disposing of places at the expense of a country, and the liberties of that country are no longer. You see, we have a Constitution which is supposed to limit what the government can do with its money, and yet it has acted outside the boundaries of the Constitution with those funds. And as a result, what does Paine say happens? The liberties of that country are no longer. And that is exactly what we see today. Our money is confiscated from us in the form of the income tax, and it is given to others. What does Obama say we have to do in this country? We have to share the wealth. That's nothing more than robbery. I'm going to forcibly take money from you in order to give it to somebody else who did not work for it or earn it and is not entitled to it. Furthermore, think of our entrenched incumbent politicians. He says the man who is in the receipt of $1,000,000 a year is the last person to promote a spirit of reform, lest in the event it should reach to himself. Do we really think these entrenched incumbent career politicians are going to seriously enact reform? No, because it will then impact them directly, and that's the last thing that they want. And so that is why it is so important that we limit these people to the amount of time they can spend in office, voting them out, and not just blindly re-electing somebody because their name is familiar and they've been there, or because they promised to bring home the bacon to the district or to the state, or they do so many different favors for different ones. We need to look carefully at who we're voting for and who we're electing, because otherwise we lose our freedoms. But here's something else I want to close on that he talks about. And that is one of the greatest improvements, he writes, that has been made for the perpetual security of and progress of constitutional liberty is the provision which the new constitutions make for occasionally revising, altering, and amending them. And he says, it's impossible to establish anything that combines principles with opinions and practice, which the progress of circumstances through a length of years will not in some measure derange or render inconsistent, and therefore to prevent inconveniencies accumulating till they discourage reformations or provoke revolutions, it is best to provide the means of regulating them as they occur. And so he says we have this amendment process with our Constitution. It is not an easy thing to do, but it is there. You don't want it to be too easy, because then all sorts of havoc could be let loose. I met with somebody today who is a Democrat running for a congressional office here in North Texas. And he said, when I asked him, what is your view of the Constitution, your approach to it, and your interpretation and understanding of it, he said, well, he believed the Constitution was a living, breathing document, and that we have to understand that the intent of the founders was to produce a document that would be alterable over time. And yes, they did. They did it through Article 5 and the amendment processes outlined there. Not that the courts can do it, or that a president can do it with the stroke of a pen, or that the people can vote it, but rather to make it so that when it is done, it is carefully thought through and accomplished. Well, those are the thoughts and the wisdom of Thomas Paine on the Constitution and why it is important and why we have it. And I hope you've enjoyed those and they've been beneficial to you. So until next week, I bid you good night and have a great week.